bringing along a friend or two. I am this year serving as the co-chair of the program committee along with Lisa Stam, and so I'm very happy to announce our conference theme this year was Use It or Lose It, Making the Most of Evaluation and Findings, I'm sure you all know. And the board chose this theme because we really wanted to highlight the pivotal role that evaluators can play in bringing about social change. Now, it doesn't always happen, but it's definitely a possibility that a lot of us work towards. And for that reason, I'm very excited to introduce our keynote speaker here. And I saw her speak at the Shri keynote in the fall, and I just immediately fell in love, even though my phone went off right in the middle of her presentation. Horribly embarrassing. I've turned it off for this. Susan Furhman has had her professional career right at the intersection of policy and research, and I think that's a very exciting place to be. She founded probably one of the most famous and pivotal policy research centers, CPRE, which I'm sure everybody knows, but stands for the Center for Policy Research and Education. She currently is serving as the president of Teachers College at Columbia, and also is serving as the president of the National Academy of Education. And as if all that wasn't enough, she's also just very poised and stylish and fabulous, and all the things that I aspire to be one day. So please join me in welcoming Susan Furhman.
Yeah, Jennifer, thank you. I didn't know it was you with the phone, but thank you anyway. And that was such a lovely introduction. So I think of a little story that Jim Hunt, governor of North Carolina, once told on a panel I was on where somebody had given him a lovely introduction, and he said, "That was just terrific. I wish my wife and mother were here." My wife would have enjoyed it. My mother would have believed it. So, I'm going to talk about connecting research and policy. And of course, I'm going to be drawing from my own background, which is education. I'm hoping that what I say has relevance in other policy areas as well. But if not, I'm sure you'll tell me during the question part of this discussion. So there's a conventional wisdom about connecting research findings and policy. And basically, it's that these two fields of endeavor are totally separate worlds. Different languages, different time frames. You know, researchers always want to qualify and, you know, say on the one hand, but then on the other, and, you know, the findings suggest, and all kinds of ways of hedging and being careful and cautious about their findings, and policymakers are, of course, impatient about that. They want, well, you know, okay, just tell me what it says. And they want it now, and that has to do with their electoral timeframes that are totally out of sync with our own timeframes. You know, especially if you think about legislators and a 2-year timeframe. But it's true for executives too. You think that school superintendent turnover in this country is exceptionally high, and I think the average term is 3 years or less. That may be an exaggeration, and so they want to get something done. And so very often, because of that, they are willing to engage in symbolic things, which many of us have lived through over our lives, rather than, you know, more meaningful change, which can take longer. And you get very frustrated as a researcher when you say, you know, that's not going to work in 2 years. Okay, you know, that's not the message that wants to be heard. So this is the conventional wisdom, and, you know, there's truth to it, but I want to say that it's a lot more complicated than that, and that I'm drawing here entirely from my own experience. So I'm going to set the limitations out. This is not a lit review. I have a lot of relevant research cited here, but you know, this is based on more years than I'd like to admit of being engaged in trying to connect research to policy through the Consortium for Policy Research and Education, CPRE, through my years at the Penn Graduate School of Education when I was dean, when I was at my current position at Teachers College, and of course at the National Academy of Education. So the first lesson in those years is that research has many uses. You know, we get frustrated because we look for the instrumental use. We look for, this is what the finding says, why aren't you implementing that? Like, for example, don't use value added. It doesn't work. If you were, therefore, focused just on instrumental use, you would go around being really, really frustrated. So yes, sometimes there are instrumental uses, but very often research has other effects, and we should be cognizant of those and try to work on those potential impacts too. For one thing, it makes you a whole lot happier than if you were just focused on the instrumental. But a broader view, and this is well backed by research, that's one of my icons, Carol Rice, who recently passed away. She's at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Research has what she would call an enlightenment aspect. It can filter into the environment and pervade the environment in a way that it shapes the agenda. It helps people understand problems, not just solve them, but understand and frame them. It can be used for defense. You know, I'm doing this, a policymaker says, because research says X. So it can be used in many, many different ways. My favorite example of instrumental use is that many years ago I was, after a nation at risk, when states were developing comprehensive educational reform packages, a colleague and I were asked to go to the National Conference of State Legislators and the Education Commission of the States, joint meeting with leaders from states to talk about these reform packages, which were really actually kind of messes. They had a lot of contradictory elements in them. And you know, you'd have higher standards on the front end and loopholes on the back end and all kinds of things which went in different directions. So we wrote a model piece of legislation that had all these problems in it, you know, not thinking about implementation, mandating everything, all kinds of issues. And we found out that it was introduced into state legislatures in a number of states afterwards. Somebody got a hold of it and introduced it. So, I mean, there's an instrumental use, right? But you don't want that to happen. So there are many different ways of thinking about use. A second lesson that we learned, and maybe this is very relevant to you, is you know that policymakers don't read journals. I mean, I know you know that. But they do, but they don't only also read the New York Times or USA Today. They rely a lot on the associations to which they belong, just as you belong to this association and, you know, as I've learned today, follow people here on Twitter. They are connected to their own membership organizations and the own channels in which they regularly receive information. And I just listed a few of the associations that I've worked with over time. And they all have newsletters and they have conferences and they have ways of communicating that are very useful if you want to get your findings out there. We learned early on at CPRE, we decided that every other center that was founded around when we were founded in 1985, federally funded research center, developed a newsletter. And our audience, because we're a policy center, focused, you know, our audience was a lot of legislators and staff. And we decided they wouldn't know how to file a newsletter. I know the word filing paper means nothing to most of you, but we did used to do that. And they wouldn't know where to put it because it had multiple topics in it. So instead, we decided to do single issue policy briefs. We did a whole bunch of those, and I think there's some pictures of some later, but on it, you know, retention in grade, dropping out, you know, standards, setting standards in the states, a whole bunch of things. And I think that got their attention because it was one issue, and because they know where to file it, and because those things could be picked up and reprinted in the association newsletters. They already got plenty of newsletters from their association, and they were. So brokers is lesson number 3, and this is my favorite broker, a good friend Michael Kurz at Stanford, who founded the Policy Analysis for California Education many years ago, I think in the 70s, in the wake of school finance reform in California, Proposition 13, and then also was a colleague of mine in CPRE. You have to spend time cultivating the audience, and I know this is daunting because their policymakers are numerous and all over, but people come to know people who can particularly translate research well, and they trust them, and they develop a relationship with them, and it helps. So we used to, having a national research center focused on state and local policy, we used to go to the association meetings face to face and get to know these people over time, year after year. With term limits, that was less successful because they kept turning over, but even more, arguably, even more important, and trying to develop relationships with them. Relationships with the staff of the associations who are much more stable than the membership, and who are the ones who decide what goes out in the newsletters to the membership and what they're going to focus on in their conferences. So we worked hard at developing relations, and in that role, trying to make the complex simple. Not simplified, but understandable, you know. We used to have a saying when accountability formulas first came into vogue, and now it's even more true with value added, that you don't want the two people who understand the formula to fly in the same plane. You also don't want that to be true of conveying your research findings. You know, transparency, understandable, it's very important. We tried very hard in CPRE to craft research that responded to client needs. So when we determined an agenda, it was after widespread consultation. We had a board representing stakeholders. We'd go to the associations and talk to people. We would try, in the course of research, to sort of listen as well when we asked them questions about a current policy, listen as well as what they were thinking of in the future, so that you could get a sense of what would be useful for them to have some research about. You know, obviously we're all driven by what's researchable, you know, by what are good questions, but we also have to be, I think, very cognizant of what the interests of the audience are, interests of the audience are. Relevant research is easy to say. It's not a word that characterizes a lot of the research going on in this country, and I'll get a little later to some of the incentives that drive us to be increasingly arcane. But that is an issue. So what do people really care about, and what do they want to know about? And it's an old finding that if research reinforces people's frame, that it has a bigger impact. That doesn't mean to say that you should just find what people want to believe. You find what you find, but if you understand what people believe, you can link what you found to what they believe, and it helps getting the research used. Now, so this next one is an old debate. Carol Weiss firmly believed that the property of research didn't matter. So this issue became really important when RCTs became the new gold standard in education, and I know they've been in other fields. A lot of the argument was that the reason research hadn't been attended to was because we weren't doing the right research. It wasn't definitive enough, it had to be causal. And everybody should do, I mean, unequivocally causal, and everyone should do RCTs, because that's what really matters. And, you know, but if you looked at the knowledge utilization literature, you would say, well, I don't know how you're making that case, because people looked at all different kinds of research, and politics trumped, research 9 times out of 10 anyway. All the other issues we've discussed were to people's timeframes, all that was important as well. But I actually do think that certain qualities of research matter. I think it's really important to address the question. I just think the question is less often what works than why. And I think a lot of the problems with frustration that I certainly, sensed at SRI about why their findings weren't being used is because the focus has only been on yes, it works or not. And that is not useful to policymakers unless they also understand why, and that may imply mixed methods. They really want to know why, and they want to know, well, you found that in Tennessee, is it going to work here? The class size study in Tennessee. Now that could either be over-adopted, where everybody applies it, or it could be greeted skeptically, because that's Tennessee. So you have to be, what we should be doing is doing more research that's replicated. And of course, the incentives aren't here either. But context matters, and they know it, policymakers know it. The thing that matters most to them is where they're from and their constituents. So to them, context really matters, and they'd love to see research that's replicated in a context close to theirs. It enhances the credibility much more than research that's done elsewhere and might be applicable. So I do think that there are qualities of research that matter. I do want to say that this is a hugely under-researched area. So we've come out of, in education, 10 years of this RCT fanaticism, and now a lot of attention back on knowledge utilization, finding that our fixation on what kind of research was being done has not mattered in use. So the question's being asked again, does the quality of research matter in use? And the use literature has been mostly focusing on either the supply side, like there should be RCTs, or the demand side, like what do policymakers think and why don't they like research, and not joining the two. There's a new National Research Council report out called The Use of Evidence that I suggest that you all take a look at, which talks about a new science of use that would bring the two together, bringing in new fields that we've never really seen in knowledge utilization, like behavioral economics and people who study decision-making from a psychological point of view to understand the user more, and then joining that with research that looks at the type of research that's being used. Synthesis. This is so critical. Here's a CPRE policy brief so you can see what we put out for many years. Policymakers want to know where this finding fits in with all the other findings. What's the weight of the evidence? Don't tell me that this study found X and forget to tell me that the 10 previous studies found Y, because the next person who walks into my office is going to tell me Y, because I know that your study is X. So tell me where the weight of the evidence is. Put it together. Tell me how this study fits into past studies and make it tell a story. This is another thing we don't reward well in our field. People don't get tenure for doing a lot of synthesis. But they're critical. They're very important. And I don't mean a lit review. I don't mean that. I mean something that deliberately speaks to the weight of the evidence. You can use meta-analysis and then translate it into understand that everyone were Jews, or you could do a more qualitative synthesis, but it has to be directly addressing where this finding that you're interested in people paying attention to fits into previous work. Okay. Lesson number 7, don't ignore implementation. Unfortunately, policymakers ignore it often enough. We should. I mean, it's the obvious that when you have an negative evaluation finding, very often we find out the program was never really implemented well, and we know that. But when we craft studies, we don't often pay attention to how much it costs to find out if it was really implemented well and price it out accordingly, because that's critical. Tend to implementation, and that information is critical to policymakers. They want to know how it plays out and how to do it. I'm working now on teacher ed issues. You know, you could get very depressed if you think about teacher ed policy. And when I talk to people about new approaches, either at the state or the federal level, new approaches to accountability in teacher education, I hear, yeah, we're going to phase it in. Of course. We have a one-year phase-in.
Oh.
Okay, that right away does not attend to implementation. This morning, there's an article in the New York Times about how New York State is doing Common Core exams before the Common Core curriculum is actually implemented. And they know it because they want to push the field, but they're going to have a whole lot of angry parents. They want to know about implementation, and they want to know from you. They don't just want to know if something works. They want to know what it means to really implement it well. So lesson number 8, you have to draw out the policy implications very specifically. And what I put up here is getting value out of value added is a report that we did at the National Academy of Education with the National Research Council. And it's a wonderful report. But we can't ever go beyond the findings in the National Academy. It's all consensus, and it's very, very careful. And you can read that report, and you'll get a sense that we should be cautious about value added, but it's muted. And nowhere does it say what to do about it. Nowhere does it say, for example, one thing you could do right away if you're going to use value added is use scores from multiple years. That cushions some of the measurement error problems. We couldn't say that in the Academy consensus report because we had no research to speak to that. It was just our supposition based on the findings about yearly measurement error and how huge it was. So I wrote an op-ed, which I don't think anyone has seen, but trying to draw out some of those findings. And because no one was finding me in an op-ed, and I could say this is what the report found, but here I think are the policy implications. These are the ones that occur to me. And if you are interested in reaching a policy audience, you might find ways of, outside of the confines of your journal article, really drawing out the policy implications based on your best sense as a researcher of what they might be, if not necessarily entirely directly linked to all your findings. Lesson 9, users are a broad group. It's not just policymakers and practitioners, but foundations are increasingly important. We've been doing a series of meetings with big foundations talking about education research and how they're driving the agenda, and you know the names here. And that is a new phenomenon in some ways, although you can look to Ford in the 70s when we did school finance reform. I worked there at the time, a part-time consultant while I was a student. And, we had a lot of influence then. But now you can list a whole bunch of foundations that are together spending what the federal government spends, if not exceeding it. And you know who they are, and they're very influential. And they don't do a lot of research. They don't support a lot of research. They support research that's strategic to their goals. They certainly don't necessarily support more basic or open-ended research. We need to think of them not just as funders of research, but as an important audience for research. I would add publishers who translate research into curricula, the press, of course, lots of different users. Okay, my final lesson is that institutional incentives don't support a lot of what I've been saying, and I've referred to this before. I just put my own, part of my own vita up here to show you that I list certain book chapters as referee. And that's really critical, because if you just do referee journal articles when you go up to tenure, you might not have the most influential output, because book chapters are much more used in graduate education than journal articles are, and that has a huge impact. So we have to be careful about how we frame cases for tenure and promotion. So we put value on some of the things I've been talking about, on synthesis, on replication. You know, what we've done in our field, and you know, I'm sure it's true of many others, is put a stress on uniqueness. Every dissertation, every journal article has to do something no one else has done before, and you can see that leads you to increasingly, as I used the word before, arcane areas of exploration. You have to do much more to revisit older findings, to test them in different contexts, and to try to make sense of the work. And I don't think as a dean, and this is mostly George from Penn, as a dean where I had to make the argument for tenure and promotion to the provost at the university level, I don't think we should be upset about that. There are, every other field we're talking of, we're sitting at that table. Engineering is a great example, but business, all these other fields, they're very applied. And they do. The engineering, you get tenure credit for, a 3-page proceedings in an Academy of Engineering, and they do a lot of replication. They come out of a science background where, remember cold fusion, replication's really, really important. And they do a lot of it, much more so than we do in social science. So, I don't think there's anything to be ashamed about when we think about the kind of work that's useful, and think about providing incentives for students and for aspiring professors to do that kind of work. So I think I will stop there and recommend again that you look at that new NRC report on the use of evidence, but I'm happy to take some questions as time permits.
Thank you, by the way. It's been extremely informative and useful. I really admire everything you've done. Here's a dilemma I'd like to present to you.
George, you have to speak up.
Oh, okay.
Oh, wait. Speak loud, I'll get you a microphone.
She's giving you mic.
Sure.
How many evaluators take?
Down it's on. I think it's on. It's on.
Is it on?
Yes.
Here's a dilemma that I'd like to ask you about the line of work that you're in. It's going to. This is not meant to attack you, it's just the opposite, but it'll sound like it. Okay, so a wonderful lesson, 10 lessons, all that sound very real to me, with some references at the bottom of them to say, read more about it here. But suppose you were the opposite to you, and you took what you said, and you said, but you really haven't proved anything that you said. It was the exact thing you're talking about. Is that what's the basis of what you've done here? How would you answer that charge? I'm very curious about it, because I value what you've done, but when we talk about it, you say, but even this stuff might not even make the American Association's journal, because what you said is not peer reviewed.
Oh, no, and I think I was very clear that I was drawing that experience. But if you looked at the literature that I cited, I think it backs it up. I don't think the research in this field is adequate by any means. And I think that, one of the things we need to do is, and I think that IES is hearing that message, the Institute for Education Sciences, is much more rigorous research on it. W.T. Grant is doing research on this, Spencer's doing research on this, much more rigorous research on use, a science of use. So read the NRC report, and that's how you would go about studying use.
As one of the authors of that report. This is a really important point that George raises, and your response is very good too. But these 10 lessons, I agree, that from a practical point of view, this is what we know. But the evidence base for use is virtually zero.
Yes.
In other words, we don't know if timeliness is more important than quality.
Right.
We don't know if fitting into the policy discourse is more important than timeliness, right?
Right.
We have, as you know, for many, many years, excellent research on early childhood education.
Yeah, right.
Wasn't timely because it wasn't on the agenda, but now it's on the agenda, so is it,
That's
right.
John Kingdon's agendas
Right.
and
Exactly.
policy with it.
So I mean, we've, in this field, which in the evaluation field, where Carol was extremely influential in
Right.
our thinking about use. Nonetheless, the literature would show you, in the evaluation literature would show you, that we really know nothing more than a long laundry list of factors. How they interact in any particular set of circumstances, we don't know. The evidence base for the use of evaluation as evidence or social science is pretty thin. It really is. And that's what our report was after, that, we spent 5 years looking at that literature and concluded that there is no general theory of use, right? And maybe never ever will be. So the focus shifts, and Michael said something about this morning. The focus shifts to thinking more carefully about some of the things you're saying here, and that is what happens at the intersection or the nexus between research and policy, as Fred Hess calls it, I think as we call it. And what goes on there? And one of our claims in the report was that we, as evaluators and social scientists, need to better understand what happens when a policy argument is made.
Right.
And how ideological as well as factual considerations figure in a policy argument, and how they can be used one way or the other. And the more we understand the nature of policy arguments, that's what you're saying, the more likely are to get that stuff used. But that's not done. Get back to George.
Could I just say one more thing?
I just want to make it very clear that I was not complaining about
No, I
either
know.
point of view. It's what I see as a dilemma.
Yeah.
And it's what we learned in philosophy, a case of extreme self-reference. In other words, that these are researchers talking about the policy, saying, but I can't prove it to you, but don't you think I'm right based on experience? And where does the American Evaluation Association position itself with these two kinds of knowledge? And it's more of a dilemma than a wishing it were one way or the other. I just don't know how to resolve it.
No, I know how. I think you should engage in the kind of research that's suggested in the report. You have to build the research base. Yes.
Just a little comment. It can certainly be a little awkward to not have a research base when we're talking about research, but I don't want to wait to build the research base before giving policymakers useful information. And so this is probably obvious, but we can do both at the same time. We can think about and collect data on how do people best receive information. And we certainly know that presenting something in arcane language to citizens or policymakers isn't going to be received. So I guess I'm just commenting on both, and it illustrates the fact that we all, even we researchers and evaluators, gain from our own experience and our intuitive knowledge, if you will, and from research. No one is walking through life paralyzed until research tells them what to do.
And I think that's all we have time for today, so please join me in thanking